The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Whitmore estate as 5 men stood in a perfectly straight line. Each wore their finest suit, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind their backs like soldiers awaiting inspection. The massive oak doors loomed before them, and beyond those doors waited their fate. Marcus Chun adjusted his tie for the third time, his resume pristine in his leather portfolio. 20 years of experience serving European nobility, he told himself. This should be straightforward. To his left, an older gentleman with silver hair stood motionless, his posture military precise. James Morrison, former butler to 3 senators. His credentials spoke volumes. The third man, Viktor Petrov, checked his pocket watch with practiced elegance. 10 years managing households for Russian oligarchs had taught him patience, but his foot tapped against the marble nonetheless. Thomas Bradford, impeccably dressed in Savile Row tailoring, stared straight ahead. His family had served British aristocracy for generations. This American millionaire would surely appreciate such heritage. At the end of the line stood David Martinez. His suit, though clean and pressed, lacked the expensive cut of the others. His hands showed calluses that no amount of scrubbing could completely hide. While the others carried leather portfolios, he held only a simple folder. Inside were references from his previous job as a hospital orderly and a letter from his daughter's teacher, praising his volunteer work with children. The heavy doors swung open. Richard Whitmore emerged from the shadows of his grand foyer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble. At 45, he commanded respect in every boardroom from New York to Tokyo, but today his eyes held an unusual weight. The responsibility of choosing the right person to care for his 80-year-old daughter, Emma, pressed heavily on his shoulders. His wife had been gone for 2 years now, and Emma had grown increasingly withdrawn. 3 butlers had already failed to connect with her. She barely spoke to anyone anymore, spending her days hidden away in her room or the library, lost in books that seemed too advanced for her age. Whitmore studied each candidate with the same intensity he used to evaluate corporate acquisitions. Marcus Chun stepped forward first, his portfolio open to display glowing recommendations from European estates. His presentation was flawless, professional, exactly what Whitmore expected. James Morrison followed with military precision, his background check revealing commendations from high-ranking officials. Viktor Petrov's accent carried the sophistication of old money, while Thomas Bradford's genealogy traced back to servants of kings. Then came David Martinez. No prestigious background, no connections to powerful families. Just honest work and a genuine smile that seemed out of place among such formality. What Whitmore didn't notice was the small face pressed against the second-floor window, watching everything with curious brown eyes. Emma had been observing from her hiding spot, studying each man carefully. The interviews concluded in Whitmore's oak-paneled study, each candidate having presented their qualifications with practiced efficiency. Whitmore dismissed them to the sitting room while he reviewed his notes, but his mind kept returning to Emma's peculiar behavior lately. She had stopped eating dinner with him, refused to speak during their daily walks, and seemed to shrink away from any adult interaction. Mrs. Henderson, the longtime housekeeper, appeared at his doorway with tea. She had watched Emma grow from a bubbly toddler into this silent, guarded child, and her concern showed in the worried creases around her eyes. We need someone who can reach her, Whitmore thought, not just someone who can serve proper tea and maintain schedules. Emma had been through enough trauma, losing her mother. The wrong choice could set her back even further. Meanwhile, upstairs, Emma crept along the hallway toward the main staircase. She had watched each man during the interviews through a crack in the study door. Most had sat rigidly, speaking only when addressed, their voices formal and distant. But one had been different. When Mrs. Henderson's cat had wandered into the study, the other men had either ignored it or looked annoyed. The man at the end, David, had quietly reached down and gently scratched behind the cat's ears, smiling softly when it purred. Emma made her decision then. She padded downstairs barefoot, her small hand gripping the banister. Emma appeared in the sitting room doorway like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. The five men turned in surprise as she entered, her dark hair falling across her shoulders, brown eyes taking in each face with careful deliberation. Whitmore rose from his chair, stunned. Emma rarely left her room during the day and never approached strangers voluntarily. The candidates straightened, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected development. She's going to choose, Whitmore realized with sudden clarity. Somehow, his 80-year-old daughter was going to make this decision for him. Marcus Chun smiled professionally and offered a slight bow. James Morrison maintained his military bearing but softened his expression. Victor checked his posture while Thomas cleared his throat nervously. David simply remained seated, watching Emma with patient eyes. He didn't try to impress her or command her attention. When she took a hesitant step into the room, he gave her the same gentle smile he had offered the cat earlier. Emma walked slowly past each candidate, studying their faces, their posture, the way they held themselves in her presence. Some tried too hard to appear friendly. Others seemed uncomfortable with a child's scrutiny. When she reached David, she stopped. He sat naturally, hands resting on his knees, making no sudden movements. His eyes were kind but not demanding, giving her space to decide. Without a word, Emma moved to stand beside his chair. The silence in the room stretched like a held breath. Whitmore stared at his daughter, bewildered by her choice. Of all the qualified candidates, she had selected the one with the least impressive credentials. David Martinez, former hospital orderly, single father, no formal butler training. This has to be a mistake, Whitmore thought. She probably just picked the least intimidating person. Children often gravitate toward whoever seems safest, not necessarily who is most capable. Where in the world are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? This moment of unexpected choice might remind you of times when children see something adults completely miss. Marcus Chun shifted uncomfortably, his perfect posture wavering slightly. 20 years of experience dismissed by a child's whim. James Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, while Victor Petrov's practiced composure showed the first crack of irritation. Whitmore cleared his throat. We should discuss this privately, Emma. Adults need to make these decisions based on qualifications and experience, not on first impressions. But Emma didn't move. She placed her small hand on the arm of David's chair, her fingers barely reaching the worn fabric. For the first time in months, she spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Him, she said simply. He understands. David looked up at Whitmore with quiet dignity. He hadn't asked to be chosen, hadn't campaigned for Emma's favor. But something in his steady gaze suggested he knew exactly why she had picked him. Whitmore's business instincts warred with his paternal concern. Every logical part of his mind screamed that credentials mattered, that experience was everything. Yet Emma had spoken more words in the past minute than she had in weeks. David rose slowly from his chair, careful not to startle Emma. Thank you for considering me, Mr. Whitmore, he said quietly. I know my background isn't what you expected, but I'd like the chance to show you what I can offer. The other candidates began gathering their portfolios, professional disappointment masked behind polite facades. Marcus Chun offered a stiff handshake, while James Morrison's military bearing carried him toward the door with dignity intact. Victor and Thomas followed suit, their expensive suits rustling as they departed. Mrs. Henderson appeared as if summoned, her maternal instincts sensing the shift in the room's energy. She had watched Emma retreat further into herself with each failed butler, and now saw something different in the child's posture. Emma stood straighter, her hands still resting protectively on David's chair. What part of this story resonates most with you? Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's heart chose differently than their head suggested? Whitmore studied David's face, searching for signs of manipulation or calculation. Instead, he found only honest concern and a patience that seemed infinite. This man wasn't trying to win a position. He was simply being present for a wounded child who desperately needed understanding. Against his better judgment, Whitmore found himself offering David a trial period. 1 week, he declared firmly. If this doesn't work out, we'll need to find someone with proper training. David nodded respectfully, understanding the skepticism behind the offer. He had faced doubt before, worked in places where his lack of formal credentials made others question his abilities. But children had always been different. They saw past resumes and recommendations to something deeper. Emma's transformation began immediately. During David's first morning, she appeared in the kitchen while he prepared breakfast, something she hadn't done since her mother's death. She perched on a stool and watched him work, her curious eyes following his careful movements. David didn't overwhelm her with questions or force conversation. Instead, he simply included her in small ways. "Would you like to help me arrange these flowers?" he asked, offering her stems to place in the vase. Her small hands worked alongside his, creating something beautiful together. Mrs. Henderson observed from the doorway, astonished. The previous butlers had tried elaborate games and expensive gifts to engage Emma, all failing miserably. David succeeded with simple presence and genuine respect for her autonomy. When Whitmore returned from his morning meetings, he found Emma and David in the garden, quietly reading separate books on the same bench. Emma's legs swung contentedly, her face peaceful for the first time in months. 3 days into David's trial period, Emma's nightmares returned with devastating force. Whitmore found himself pacing the hallway at 2 in the morning, listening to his daughter's distressed cries echoing through the mansion. These episodes had plagued her since losing her mother, and no amount of therapy or medication seemed to help. Mrs. Henderson appeared in her robe, worry etched across her weathered face. The previous butlers had either ignored these midnight crises or handled them with awkward, ineffective attempts at comfort. Most simply waited for the episodes to pass naturally. David emerged from his quarters already dressed, moving with quiet purpose toward Emma's room. Whitmore started to intervene, protective instincts flaring, but something in David's confident stride made him pause. Through the partially open door, Whitmore watched David approach Emma's bed where she thrashed in the grip of another nightmare. Instead of waking her abruptly or speaking loudly, David sat gently on the edge of her mattress and began humming a soft, melodic tune. His voice was barely audible, but the rhythm seemed to penetrate Emma's distress. Her movements gradually slowed, her breathing deepened, and the tension melted from her small frame. David's hand hovered near her shoulder, not quite touching, but offering reassuring presence. Within minutes, Emma settled into peaceful sleep. David remained beside her bed for another hour, ensuring the nightmare wouldn't return before quietly slipping away. The next morning brought another revelation. Emma, who had barely spoken complete sentences in months, sat at the breakfast table engaging in actual conversation with David. She told him about her favorite books, her memories of her mother, and even laughed at his gentle jokes. Whitmore stood in the doorway, coffee growing cold in his hands as he listened to his daughter's voice returning to life. The sound stirred emotions he had buried deep since his wife's passing. Emma's laughter had been absent from this house for so long that hearing it now felt almost surreal. Mrs. Henderson bustled around the kitchen with renewed energy, her step lighter than it had been in years. She had raised 3 children of her own and recognized something special in David's approach. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was skill. David seemed to understand Emma's needs before she even expressed them. When she grew quiet, he gave her space. When she needed reassurance, he offered it without overwhelming her. His responses showed an intuitive grasp of child development that went far beyond common sense. During lunch, Emma asked David about his own daughter. His face softened as he spoke about Sophia, 8 years old like Emma, who stayed with her grandmother while he worked. The love in his voice was unmistakable, and Emma listened with rapt attention. That evening, Emma voluntarily joined her father for dinner for the first time since David's arrival, chattering excitedly about her day. The crisis struck during Emma's afternoon playtime in the garden. A bee sting on her arm triggered a severe allergic reaction that no one knew she possessed. Her breathing became labored, her face flushed crimson, and panic seized her small body as she struggled for air. Mrs. Henderson screamed for help while Whitmore frantically dialed emergency services, his hands shaking as he watched his daughter's lips begin to turn blue. The ambulance was still minutes away, and Emma's condition was deteriorating rapidly. David appeared instantly, his demeanor shifting from gentle caretaker to focused medical professional. He assessed Emma's symptoms with clinical precision, checking her pulse, observing her breathing patterns, and evaluating the swelling around the sting site. Without hesitation, he scooped Emma into his arms and carried her inside, calling out specific instructions to Mrs. Henderson. Get ice from the freezer and elevate her legs. Call Dr. Peterson and tell him we need epinephrine immediately. His voice carried the authority of someone who had handled medical emergencies before, someone trained to remain calm under life-threatening pressure. Whitmore watched in stunned silence as David positioned Emma correctly, monitored her vital signs, and administered basic first aid with expert technique. When the paramedics arrived, David briefed them with professional terminology, describing Emma's symptoms and the timeline of her reaction. They listened with the respect reserved for fellow medical personnel. Emma's breathing stabilized during the ambulance ride to the hospital. In the hospital waiting room, Whitmore confronted David with questions that had been building since the emergency. Your response back there, that wasn't basic first aid training. You knew exactly what to do. David sat quietly for a moment, his hands clasped together, the weight of his hidden past pressing against his chest. He had hoped to keep his former life private, but Emma's crisis had forced his hand. I was a pediatric nurse for 12 years, he said finally, specialized in emergency care and child trauma recovery. I worked at Children's Hospital downtown until 3 years ago. The revelation hit Whitmore like a physical blow. A pediatric nurse, someone trained specifically to help children through medical and emotional crises. Someone who understood child development, trauma response, and healing. What happened 3 years ago? Whitmore asked, though something in David's expression suggested the answer would be painful. My wife died in a car accident, David replied, his voice steady but hollow. Sophia was in the car too. She survived, but the trauma changed everything. I couldn't handle being around other people's children when I was failing my own daughter. So I left nursing, took whatever work I could find. The pieces fell into place with startling clarity. David's intuitive understanding of Emma's needs, his professional response to her nightmares, his ability to help her heal. This wasn't luck or natural talent. This was years of specialized training and experience. Emma recovered fully from her allergic reaction, but the experience transformed everything. Whitmore sat across from David in his study 3 days later, seeing him with completely new eyes. The man he had nearly dismissed as unqualified was exactly what his daughter needed. I owe you an apology, Whitmore said quietly. And more than that, I owe you my daughter's life. She saw something in you that I completely missed. David shook his head gently. Children often see what adults overlook. Emma knew she needed someone who understood her pain. I've been exactly where she is. The conversation that followed changed both their lives. Whitmore offered David a permanent position, not as a butler, but as Emma's personal care coordinator, with a salary reflecting his true qualifications. More importantly, he invited David to bring Sophia to live at the estate, creating the family environment both girls desperately needed. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Your support helps us to share these powerful moments of human connection. 2 weeks later, Emma and Sophia raced through the mansion's halls, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. David watched from the kitchen doorway, his own healing finally beginning as he helped these children reclaim their joy. Whitmore joined him, amazed at the transformation in his home. Sometimes the heart chooses more wisely than the mind, he observed. David smiled, thinking of his daughter's bright future and Emma's remarkable recovery. Sometimes it does.